The humid air of the Louisiana bayou clung to Elias Greystone like a second skin as he trudged along the overgrown path toward the family plantation. It was the summer of 1857, and the sun hung low, painting the cypress trees in strokes of bruised purple. Elias, broad-shouldered and deliberate in his steps, wiped sweat from his brow with a calloused hand. At 32, he carried the weight of the land on his back, the endless fields of sugarcane that yielded just enough to keep the debts at bay. His wife, Clara, walked beside him, her skirts brushing against the ferns, her dark hair pinned back but fraying in the heat. She was the steady one, with eyes that missed nothing and a voice that could calm a storm, though lately she'd grown quieter, her gaze lingering on the house as if it held secrets she couldn't voice. Their daughter, young Annabelle, skipped ahead, her laughter cutting through the drone of cicadas. At 10, she was all curiosity and fire, her braids swinging like pendulums as she darted toward the wrought iron gate. "Papa, look, the roses are blooming again. But they're so red, like blood on the petals." Elias forced a smile, though unease twisted in his gut. The Greystone estate had stood for generations, its white columns rising like ghosts against the moss-draped oaks. But this year, something felt off. Whispers from the overseers spoke of bad omens, tools vanishing into the soil, shadows that didn't match the sun's arc. Elias shook it off. He was a man of soil and sweat, not superstitions. As they approached the veranda, the house seemed to exhale, a faint creak from the shutters, as if welcoming them home. Clara paused at the steps, her hand resting on the balustrade. "Elias, did you notice the paint? It's peeling more than last week." He glanced up, squinting. The walls, once pristine, bore faint cracks like veins beneath pale skin. He shrugged it off. "Just the damp. We'll whitewash it come fall." Inside, the foyer enveloped them in cool shadow, the scent of polished wood and faint lavender from Clara's sachets. Annabelle bolted toward the staircase, her footsteps echoing. "I'm going to my room. I left my doll there." Elias watched her go, a flicker of protectiveness tightening his chest. The house had always been their anchor, built by his grandfather after the floods of 32. But tonight, as he lit the lamps, the flame danced oddly, casting long fingers across the wallpaper. Clara busied herself in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with rhythmic thuds, while Elias settled into his chair by the hearth. The fire wasn't lit, too warm for that, but he felt a chill anyway, settling into his bones. Outside, the bayou murmured, frogs chorusing in the twilight. Upstairs, Annabelle pushed open her door, the hinges sighing softly. Her room was a haven of faded quilts and shelves lined with shells from the river. She scooped up her doll, a porcelain-faced thing with glass eyes that seemed to follow her movements. As she hugged it close, her fingers brushed the wall beside her bed. A warm stickiness met her touch. She pulled back, staring. A thin red line seeped from the plaster, blooming like ink in water. "Mama," she called, voice small. But the house swallowed the sound, and the line thickened, dripping slowly onto the floorboards. Downstairs, Elias rose at the distant thud, perhaps a branch against the window. He climbed the stairs, calling Annabelle's name. The air grew thicker, laced with something metallic. When he reached her door, she stood frozen, pointing. The wall wept crimson, the stains spreading in deliberate rivulets. Elias touched it, and the warmth shocked him, like flesh yielding under pressure. His hand came away smeared. "What in God's name?" Clara appeared behind him, her face draining of color. The house, their sanctuary, had turned against them. And as the blood pooled at their feet, Elias realized this was no mere leak from the roof. Something deeper stirred within the walls, hungry and awake. Elias Greystone wiped the sweat from his brow with a sleeve already stained from the morning's labors. The Louisiana sun hung heavy in the sky, turning the air thick as molasses, but inside the old plantation house, the shadows clung cooler, almost clammy against his skin. He'd inherited the place from his late uncle, a man who'd vanished years ago without a trace, leaving only whispers of bad luck and unpaid debts. Elias had brought his family here hoping for a fresh start. Lydia with her unyielding optimism, young Eliza with her sharp tongue, and little Thomas, who trailed after them like a shadow pup. But now, as he hammered the last loose board into the parlor floor, a strange unease settled in his gut. Lydia appeared in the doorway, her apron dusted with flour from the kitchen. "Elias, the children's room is ready. Eliza's already claiming the biggest bed, says it's hers by right of discovery." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. The house had that effect, pulling at the edges of their cheer like damp rot. He nodded, setting down the hammer. "Good. We'll need rest tonight. This place, it feels like it's watching us." He didn't mean to say it aloud, but the words slipped out, echoing faintly off the high ceilings. From upstairs came a shout, Eliza's voice, high and indignant. "Thomas, get away from that wall." Elias exchanged a glance with Lydia, and they hurried up the creaking stairs, the banister smooth under his calloused palm, worn by hands long gone. The children's room overlooked the overgrown bayou, its windows framed by vines that snaked in like uninvited guests. Eliza stood with hands on hips, her dark curls escaping their braid, glaring at her brother. Thomas, no more than 8, knelt by the far wall, his small fingers tracing a dark streak that hadn't been there before. "It's just mud," he said defensively, but his voice wavered. Elias knelt beside him, heart quickening. The streak was no mud. It gleamed wet, a deep crimson that seeped from a crack in the plaster, slow as a tear. He touched it tentatively, and his fingertip came away slick, warm. Blood. Real blood, metallic and fresh, staining the whitewashed wall like an accusation. Lydia gasped, crossing herself. "Lord have mercy. What is this place?" Eliza backed away, her wit deserting her for a moment. It can't be from an animal. Pa, we should leave. Right now." But Elias pressed his hand flat against the wall, feeling the give beneath the surface, as if the stone itself pulsed. More seeped out, spreading in thin rivulets that followed the grain of the wood beneath. The air grew heavier, carrying a faint, coppery tang that made his stomach turn. "No," he said firmly, though doubt gnawed at him. "We've come this far. It could be a leak from the roof, or pipes. I'll fetch the doctor from town tomorrow." Thomas whimpered, wiping his hand on his trousers, leaving a smear. "It hurts where I touched it, Pa. Like nettles." Lydia pulled him close, her arms a shield. "Then we clean it. Now." She fetched rags from downstairs, and they worked in silence, scrubbing at the stain. But for every swipe, more appeared, as if the wall wept in response. The sun dipped lower outside, casting long shadows that danced like fingers across the floorboards. By dusk, the streak was gone, scrubbed to a faint pink, but the house felt different, quieter, holding its breath. They gathered in the kitchen for a meager supper of cornbread and salt pork, the family's voices low. Eliza poked at her food. "Uncle said this house was cursed, remember? Before he disappeared. Said the walls remembered things they shouldn't." "Hush that," Elias snapped, sharper than intended. But Lydia's hand trembled as she poured water, and Thomas wouldn't eat, claiming his throat burned. That night, as thunder rumbled distant over the swamps, Elias lay awake beside Lydia, listening to the house settle. A soft drip echoed from the walls, rhythmic, insistent. He rose quietly, lantern in hand, and followed the sound to the parlor. There, where he'd hammered the floor, a fresh line of red traced the baseboard, pooling in the cracks like ink from a broken quill. He touched it again, and this time, the warmth spread up his arm, a burning itch that made him yank back with a curse. Upstairs, Eliza stirred in her sleep, murmuring about bleeding stones. The house groaned, as if answering her. Elias stood frozen, the lantern light flickering, revealing more stains blooming across the ceiling like storm clouds. Whatever this was, it wasn't done with them yet. Elias wiped the sweat from his brow, the humid air of the plantation house clinging to his skin like a second layer. The lantern's flame flickered against the peeling wallpaper in the upstairs hallway, casting shadows that twisted like roots across the floorboards. It was well past midnight, and the distant croak of frogs from the bayou outside did little to ease the knot in his stomach. Clara had insisted they search the attic after supper, convinced that the strange stains on the walls below weren't just from the recent rains. Thomas trailed behind, his footsteps light but deliberate, while Eliza clutched her mother's skirt, her wide eyes darting to every creak. "Pa, you think it's mold?" Thomas asked, his voice pitched low, trying for that clever edge he always affected when nerves got the better of him. He was the one who'd first noticed the reddish smears that morning, smudging his fingers when he brushed against the parlor wall. Elias had dismissed it as rust from the old pipes, but now, with the house settling into an unnatural quiet, doubt gnawed at him. "Not mold," Clara murmured, her hand steady as she pushed open the attic door. Dust motes swirled in the lantern light, revealing trunks shrouded in cobwebs and a single narrow window smeared with grime. The air up here was thicker, laced with a metallic tang that made Elias's nose wrinkle. He stepped forward, boots thudding softly on the warped planks, and reached out to steady himself against a beam. His palm met the wood, rough and cool, but as he pulled away, a thin line of crimson welled up from the grain, beating like fresh blood. Clara gasped, the sound sharp in the confined space. "Elias, look." She pointed to the wall beside the window, where faint outlines of hands, dozens of them, pressed against the plaster from within, as if trapped souls were reaching out. Eliza whimpered, burying her face in her mother's dress, but Thomas edged closer, his curiosity overriding fear for a moment. He extended a finger, hesitating, then touched one of the shadowy prints. The wall didn't bleed, not like with Elias, but the print seemed to shift, the fingers curling inward as if grasping. "It's not just bleeding," Thomas whispered, his wit faltering into awe. "It's responding." Elias grabbed his son's shoulder, pulling him back roughly. The house had been in the family for generations, inherited from an uncle who'd vanished during a fever outbreak years back. They'd moved in only a week ago, chasing the promise of steady land after the bank's foreclosure back in New Orleans. But now, with the walls weeping and these impossible marks, the promise felt like a curse. Clara knelt by an old trunk, prying the lid open with a rusted clasp. Inside lay yellowed letters, bundled with twine, and a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked like dry earth. She lifted the journal carefully, pages crackling as she thumbed through. "This is Uncle Harlan's handwriting," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "He writes about the foundations, says the house was built over an old burial ground, slaves from the plantation before the war. But there's more rituals, to keep the restless down." Elias leaned over her shoulder, the lantern casting their shadows long across the floor. The entries grew frantic toward the end, warnings about touches that bound you, walls that remembered every hand laid upon them. One passage described a night much like this, when the bleeding started and wouldn't stop, soaking the floors until the very earth drank it back. "We have to leave," Elias said finally, his caution winning out. But as he spoke, a low groan echoed from below, like the house shifting on unwilling bones. The window rattled, though no wind stirred the curtains downstairs. Eliza tugged at Clara's sleeve. "Mama, it's hungry." The words hung in the air, childlike and piercing, born from the stories the girl had overheard from the field hands. Thomas shot her a look, half scolding, but his face paled when another handprint bloomed on the attic wall, this one fresh and dripping. Clara closed the journal with a snap, tucking it under her arm. "Not tonight. We seal this place up at dawn. But first, we get out of this attic, carefully." They moved as one, Elias leading with the lantern held high, avoiding every surface that might demand a toll. The stairs creaked under their weight, each step a negotiation with the darkness. Down in the hallway, the air felt heavier, the metallic scent stronger. Elias paused at the door to their bedroom, hand hovering over the knob. When he turned it, the wood resisted, then gave way with a wet suck, leaving his fingers slick. He didn't look down, didn't want to see the stain. Inside, the bed waited, sheets undisturbed, but the wall above it now bore a single, deliberate mark, like a signature in blood. The family huddled together on the floor, backs to the far wall they swore not to touch. Thomas whispered questions about the journal, his mind racing for a solution, while Clara read passages by lantern light, searching for a way to appease whatever stirred. Elias kept watch, his brave facade cracking as the night deepened, the house's pulse syncing with their own. Outside, the bayou whispered secrets, but inside, the walls pressed closer, waiting for the next touch. Elias Greystone wiped the sweat from his brow, the humid air of the plantation house clinging to his skin like a second layer of damp cloth. It was midday, the sun filtering through the cracked shutters in hazy shafts that did little to warm the chill that had settled in his bones since dawn. His wife, Clara, knelt by the parlor wall, her fingers hovering just inches from the faded wallpaper, as if afraid to bridge the final gap. Their daughter, young Annabelle, stood back by the doorway, clutching a rag doll with eyes stitched wide in perpetual surprise. "Pa, it happened again last night," Annabelle whispered, her voice barely cutting through the heavy silence. "I heard it weeping." Elias nodded, not trusting his own voice yet. The sounds had started subtle, a low murmur like rain on tin, but by midnight they swelled into something guttural, a chorus of sighs that seemed to rise from the very foundation. He had risen from bed, lantern in hand, and pressed his palm to the wall in the hallway. The paper had yielded like flesh, warm and pulsing, and when he pulled away, his hand came back slick with dark crimson that smelled of iron and earth. It wasn't paint or sap from the old oaks outside. It was blood, real as the scars on his knuckles from the fields. Clara's hand trembled as she finally touched it. The wall shuddered under her fingertips, a ripple traveling up like a vein surfacing. She gasped, drawing back, and a thin rivulet seeped from the seam where wallpaper met baseboard, pooling on the oak floor in lazy curls. "Lord have mercy," she breathed, her cautious nature cracking for a moment into raw fear. Elias had always admired that in her, the way she measured her steps, planned their meals down to the last grain of rice, but now it felt like a delay, a hesitation that let the horror deepen its roots. "We can't stay here," Elias said, his voice steady despite the knot in his gut. He was the brave one, the man who'd crossed the bayou on a raft of his own making to claim this land, but bravery felt hollow against whatever cursed this place. The Greystones had bought the estate sheep from a widow who spoke in riddles, her eyes darting to the walls as if they might answer back. Now, with the cotton wilting under some unseen blight and the slaves whispering of spirits unbound, it all connected in Elias's mind like threads in a noose. Annabelle edged closer, her small frame casting a long shadow in the light. "What if it's Mama's kin? The stories say the ground here remembers." Her words hung, witty in their childlike logic, but laced with the dread she'd inherited from nights of uneasy sleep. Clara shot her a look, but Elias knelt beside his daughter, pulling her close. The bleeding had worsened since Annabelle's birth 9 years ago, as if the house fed on their presence, growing bolder with each generation. He stood, resolve hardening. "We'll burn it, if we must. Pack what you can, essentials only." Clara rose, wiping her stained hand on her apron, her face set in that familiar determination. But as she turned toward the stairs, a low groan echoed from above, not from the walls this time, but from the ceiling beams themselves. Dust sifted down like ash, and the air thickened with a metallic tang. Elias grabbed the axe from beside the hearth, its blade still dull from chopping last season's deadwood. "Stay here," he told them, though he knew they wouldn't. Clara followed a step behind, her hand on his arm, while Annabelle trailed, doll forgotten on the floor. They climbed the creaking stairs, each step protesting as if the house resented their ascent. At the landing, the hallway stretched dim and narrow, doors to unused rooms gaping like open wounds. He pushed open the door to the master bedroom, the one they'd claimed upon arrival. The four-poster bed stood untouched, sheets rumpled from their restless night. But the far wall, the one facing the overgrown garden, had changed. Cracks spiderwebbed across it, not from age, but fresh, as if clawed from within. Elias approached, axe raised, and laid his free hand against the plaster. It was hot, feverish, and beneath his palm, something shifted, a slow, deliberate throb like a heart stirring awake. Blood welled up around his fingers, soaking through to his wrist, but this time it didn't stop at the surface. It flowed, thick and insistent, tracing patterns that resembled veins branching toward the ceiling. Clara cried out, pulling at him, but he held firm, staring as the liquid formed words, or were they faces? Distorted, pleading masks that smeared and reformed in the crimson tide. "Get the children out," he growled, though Annabelle was already there, peering past her mother's skirts. The house was no longer just bleeding, it was alive, demanding something from them. Elias swung the axe, embedding it deep into the wall. Plaster crumbled, revealing not lath and studs, but a dark cavity pulsing with wet warmth. From within came a whisper, not wind, but voices, faint, overlapping, calling names that weren't theirs. They fled down the stairs, the flow chasing them, staining the treads in their wake. Outside, the air was still, the bayou silent under the relentless sun. But Elias knew this was only the beginning. The house had marked them now, its blood a bond they couldn't wash away. As Clara bundled Annabelle into the wagon, he glanced back at the facade, where windows wept red streaks down the whitewashed siding. The Greystone legacy, it seemed, was one of slow consumption. Elias wiped the sweat from his brow, the humid air clinging to his skin like a second layer of damp cloth. The lantern's flame flickered in the study's dim corner, casting long shadows that danced across the bookshelves. He had been poring over the old journals for hours, his fingers smudged with ink and something darker, residue from the wall he dared not touch again. Outside, the cicadas' chorus swelled, a relentless hum that pressed against the windows like an unseen crowd. Clara stood by the door, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, eyes darting to the paneling. She hadn't spoken since they found the stain in the hallway, that crimson seep that bloomed under her palm when she steadied herself. "It's spreading," she whispered now, her voice barely cutting through the insect's song. "I can smell it, copper and rot, like the bayou after a storm." He looked up, his jaw set in that stubborn line she knew too well. Elias Greystone, the man who tamed wild acres and built this house from nothing, reduced to whispering fears in his own home. "It's not the house," he said, though his tone wavered. "Just old pipes, maybe. Or the roots from that oak out front, twisting through the foundation." But even as he spoke, his gaze flicked to the wall behind him, where a faint line of discoloration ran like a vein from floor to ceiling. Young Thomas hovered near the desk, his small hands fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. At 10, he was all wide eyes and quick breaths, the family's quiet observer who noticed too much. He had been the first to point out the whispers last week, soft murmurs that seemed to rise from the floorboards at night. Now, he edged closer to his mother, pointing at the bookshelf. "Papa, look. It's moving." Elias followed his son's gaze. There, along the edge of a leather-bound volume, a droplet welled up, dark and viscous, tracing a slow path down the spine. It wasn't water. It hung too heavy, too red in the lantern light. Clara gasped, stepping back until her shoulders hit the opposite wall. Her hand flew up instinctively, fingers splaying against the wood. And there it was again. Warmth, slick and pulsing, as if the paneling breathed beneath her touch. She yanked her hand away, staring at the smeared print left behind, glistening wet. "Lord have mercy," she breathed, her voice trembling. The room seemed to close in, the air thicker now, laced with that metallic tang. Elias rose, knocking over the inkwell in his haste. Black liquid spread across the desk like spilled blood. He grabbed a cloth from the drawer, pressing it to the bookshelf, but the droplet only smeared further, soaking through the fabric. "We need to get out," he muttered, more to himself than them. "Fetch the satchel from the hall, Thomas. We're leaving at dawn." But Thomas didn't move. His face had gone pale, eyes fixed on the floor where a thin rivulet now snaked from under the desk, inching toward his bare feet. It wasn't from the inkwell. This was fresher, brighter, carrying the faint scent of earth and decay. The boy froze, his breath coming in shallow bursts. Clara knelt beside him, pulling him close, but her skirt brushed the edge of the flow. Fabric darkened instantly, and she felt the warmth seep through, sticky and insistent. The whispers started then, not from the floorboards this time, but from the walls themselves, low, indistinct murmurs like voices drowned in water. Elias spun, lantern raised, its light sweeping across the room. Shadows twisted, revealing more stains, handprints, faint outlines of faces pressed from within the plaster. One near the window looked almost like old Monsieur Duval, the previous owner, his eyes hollowed out in the grain of the wood. "We can't wait for dawn," Clara said, her voice steadying as fear sharpened her resolve. She stood, wiping her hand on her apron, though the stain lingered like a brand. "The horses are saddled in the barn. Thomas, stay between us." She took her son's hand, avoiding the floor's creeping line, and moved toward the door. Elias nodded, extinguishing the lantern with a quick breath. Darkness swallowed the room, but the whispers grew clearer, a chorus of pleas and accusations weaving through the air. As they slipped into the hall, the house groaned, a deep, settling sigh that rattled the chandeliers. Behind them, the study's door creaked shut on its own, sealing in the secrets they had disturbed. But out here, in the corridor's gloom, the walls waited, their surfaces cool for now, yet humming with anticipation. The lantern's flame guttered in the humid air, casting long shadows that danced like specters across the parlor walls. Elias Greystone wiped the sweat from his brow, his calloused hands trembling slightly as he set the light down on the scarred oak table. The room smelled of damp earth and something metallic, sharper now, as if the house itself were exhaling blood. Clara stood by the window, her fingers tracing the edge of a lace curtain, but she didn't look out at the moonlit bayou. Her eyes were fixed on the wall behind the mantel, where a fresh seep had begun, an oily crimson trickle that pooled at the baseboard like tears from a wound. "Can't ignore it no more," Thomas said, his voice low but steady, breaking the silence that had thickened since supper. He was the youngest, barely 20, with the broad shoulders of a man who'd spent his days in the fields before the fever took their workers. He hefted the crowbar he'd fetched from the barn, its iron head glinting dully. "We pry it open, see what's festering inside. Ain't no other way." Eliza shook her head from her perch on the settee, her knees drawn up under her skirts. She was the careful one, always had been, with a mind for ledgers and whispers of the old Creole tales her mama had told before passing. "And if it's the walls themselves? Like that priest said in town, cursed ground, blood calling to blood. You crack, Thomas, and what pours out? We ain't equipped for demons." Clara turned then, her wit sharpening her words like a knife. "Demons or rot, it's eating us alive. The cotton's wilting in the fields, the livestock's gone skittish, and now the overseer up and left without a word. If we wait for divine intervention, we'll be swimming in it." She nodded toward the wall, where the seep had widened, a dark vein pulsing faintly under the plaster. Elias rose slowly, his joints aching from years spent over the plantation's demands. He was no stranger to hard choices, surviving the war's echoes, the floods that swallowed half their land, but this felt different, a wrongness that clawed at his gut. "Thomas is right. We start small. That corner panel, loose since the last storm. If it's just termites or moisture, we seal it. If not—" He trailed off, picking up a chisel from the table. The family gathered closer, the air heavy with the bayou's night chorus of frogs and insects, a deceptive lullaby. They worked in silence at first, the chisel biting into the wood with a sound like tearing flesh. Splinters flew, and Thomas wedged the crowbar in, muscles straining as he levered. A crack split the air, and the panel gave way, revealing not the expected lattice of beams, but a hollow space, black as pitch. Elias thrust the lantern forward, and the light caught on something wet, glistening, a mat of roots, twisted and red, snaking through the cavity like veins under skin. "Lord have mercy," Eliza whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. The roots quivered, as if breathing, and a drop of blood, thick, warm, fell from one to the floor, sizzling faintly on the boards. Clara stepped back, her face paling. It's alive. The house it's feeding. Before Elias could respond, a low groan echoed from deeper within the wall, vibrating through the floorboards. The lantern flames surged, then died, plunging them into darkness pierced only by the sickly glow of the seeping blood. Thomas cursed, fumbling for matches, but the groan rose again, closer, and with it came a whisper, indistinct, like wind through reeds, but carrying their names. Elias's heart pounded. He grabbed Clara's arm, pulling her toward the door, but the threshold seemed farther now, the room stretching in the gloom. Eliza screamed as something brushed her ankle, a root, uncoiling from the floor, slick and insistent. Thomas swung the crowbar blindly, connecting with a wet thud, but the darkness swallowed the sound. They stumbled out into the hall, slamming the parlor door behind them, the wood hot to the touch. Leaning against it, chests heaving, they listened to the house settle. Or was it laugh? The whispers fading into the night. In the dim light of the hallway oil lamp, Elias met their eyes, his caution cracking under the weight. We burn it. Tomorrow before dawn. The whole cursed place. But even as he said it, he knew the roots ran deeper, binding them all, and the bayou outside held its breath, waiting. Elias gripped the lantern tighter, its flame flickering like a heartbeat against the damp walls of the root cellar. The air down here was thick, laced with the sour tang of earth and something metallic he couldn't place. Beside him, Clara huddled close, her breath coming in shallow bursts, while young Theo pressed against her skirts, his small hands clutching a splintered broom handle like a sword. They'd fled here after the upstairs hallway twisted again. Impossibly, the corridor that should have led to the front door now ended in a blank wall of pulsating stone, slick with what looked like fresh blood. "Pa, it's getting colder," Clara whispered, her voice barely cutting through the gloom. She was the steady one, always had been, mending clothes and rationing meal with a calm that bordered on defiance. But now her fingers trembled as she adjusted the shawl around Theo's shoulders. Elias nodded, scanning the shadows. The cellar had been their last hope, a place untouched by the house's madness so far. But as he stepped forward, his boots sank into the soft floor, mud giving way to something warmer, stickier. He knelt, holding the lantern low. Crimson seeped up from the ground, pooling around his knees, carrying the faint scent of copper and decay. "Lord have mercy," he muttered, pulling back. The walls above them groaned, a low rumble that vibrated through the stones. Theo whimpered, pointing with his broom. "It's moving, Pa, like it's alive." Elias followed the boy's gaze. Thin veins of red traced across the ceiling, branching like roots seeking water, dripping slowly onto the shelves of jars that lined the walls. One shattered with a crack, preserves spilling out in a dark slurry that mixed with the blood. Clara pulled Theo away, but Elias stood, rage flickering in his chest. This house had taken everything, their savings, their health, and now it hungered for more. He'd built it with his own hands, poured sweat and dreams into these walls after the war, thinking it a sanctuary in the bayou's wilds. But since the fever took mother last spring, the Greystone had turned against them. "We can't stay," Elias said, his voice rough but firm. He was the brave one, the widower who dragged his children through yellow fever and floods, always pushing forward. "There's a back way out, through the old tunnel Father dug for smuggling. If we can reach it before—" He trailed off as the veins thickened, the bleeding walls contracting like a slow, deliberate breath. Clara's eyes widened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she rummaged in a crate, pulling out a rusted shovel. "Then let's dig if we have to. Theo, stay by me." The boy nodded, his wide eyes reflecting the lantern's glow, but he gripped the broom tighter, mimicking his father's resolve. They moved as one, Elias leading with the light, the floor squelching underfoot. Each step left bloody prints, and the air grew heavier, pressing on their lungs. A whisper echoed from the walls, not words, but a susurrus like wind through reeds, pulling at their thoughts. Elias shook his head, focusing on the far corner where the tunnel entrance should be, hidden behind a false panel. But as they approached, the panel wasn't wood. It pulsed flesh-like, resisting his push. "Push harder, Pa," Theo urged, his voice high with urgency. Elias leaned in, shoulder to the barrier, grunting with effort. It gave way with a wet tear, revealing not the expected dirt tunnel, but a narrow passage lined with glistening membranes, veined and throbbing. Blood welled from the edges, trickling down in rivulets that formed a shallow stream at their feet. Clara hesitated, her cautious nature warring with the need to escape. What if this leads deeper in? It has to lead out, Elias insisted, though doubt gnawed at him. He stepped through first, the membrane clinging to his clothes like sodden silk. The passage sloped downward, the air turning fetid, alive with the buzz of unseen insects. Behind them, the cellar walls closed in with a slurping sound, sealing their retreat. They pressed on, the light casting grotesque shadows, elongated figures that seemed to reach for them. Theo stumbled, splashing into the stream, and cried out as it burned like acid on his skin. Clara scooped him up, her face pale but set. "Keep moving," she said through gritted teeth, her wits surfacing in the strain. "Unless you fancy becoming part of the family wallpaper." Elias forced a grim smile, but his mind raced. The house was adapting, learning their fears, turning the very ground against them. If they didn't find daylight soon, the blood would claim them all, seeping into their veins until nothing human remained. The passage narrowed, forcing them single file, and ahead, a faint glow beckoned. Not the sun, but something redder, hungrier. Elias gripped the iron poker from the fireplace, its weight a small comfort in the dim parlor. The air hung thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, like pennies left too long in a pocket. Outside, the Louisiana night pressed against the windows, rain pattering like impatient fingers. Theo paced near the hearth, his boots scuffing the worn rug, while Clara sat rigid in the armchair, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief until it frayed. "We can't just wait for dawn," Theo said, his voice low but edged with that sharp wit that always cut through fear. "The bleeding's spreading. Saw it in the kitchen this morning, seeping up from the floorboards like veins under skin." Clara's eyes flicked to the wall behind her, where a faint red stain had bloomed hours ago, unresponsive now but ominous in the candlelight. "And your plan? Chanting words from that old book? It only made it worse last night. The walls, they pulsed." Elias nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. The book, a tattered volume Theo had found in the attic amid yellowed letters and forgotten ledgers, spoke of spirits bound to the land, restless from the plantation's bloody past, slaves' whispers, overseers' whips, lives cut short in the cane fields. They tried the incantation at midnight, voices trembling in unison, but instead of banishing the presence, the house had groaned, and blood had trickled from the ceiling in slow, deliberate rivulets. A floorboard creaked upstairs, sharper than the rain's rhythm. Lila's room. Elias's heart thudded. She was only 10, tucked in with the quilt pulled high, but sleep had eluded her since the first bleed 2 weeks past. "I'll check on her," he muttered, starting for the stairs. Theo blocked his path, eyes wide. "Wait. Listen." The creak came again, followed by a soft, wet sound, like cloth tearing slowly. Clara rose, her caution fracturing into urgency. "It's moving." They climbed together, the poker heavy in Elias's fist. The staircase walls, once pristine whitewash, now bore faint crimson streaks, as if the house wept in secret. At the landing, the air grew colder, breath visible in faint puffs. Lila's door stood ajar, a sliver of darkness beyond. Elias pushed it open. Moonlight slanted through the window, illuminating the bed where Lila lay curled, her small chest rising and falling evenly. But the walls, oh, the walls! They glistened, a fresh sheen of red coating the plaster from wainscot to cornice, dripping in lazy trails that pooled on the floorboards. One drop fell onto the quilt's edge, soaking in like ink on parchment. Lila, Elias whispered, shaking her shoulder gently. She stirred, eyes fluttering open, but before she could speak, her hand brushed the bedpost. The wood, dark oak carved with vines, split with a crack. Blood welled from the grain, thick and warm, splattering her nightgown. She screamed, a piercing wail that echoed through the house. Theo lunged forward, yanking her away, but his sleeve caught the wall. A gash opened in the plaster as if clawed from within, spraying red across his shirt. "It's alive," he gasped, witty facade crumbling. "The whole damn place." Clara snatched a blanket, wrapping Lila as they backed toward the door. But the floor beneath them buckled, wood splintering with a sound like bones breaking. Elias swung the poker at the wall, the iron biting deep, and for a moment, the bleeding slowed, the house holding its breath. Then it retaliated. From the ceiling, a fissure raced across, raining droplets that burned like acid on their skin. They fled down the stairs, Lila clutched between Theo and Clara, Elias bringing up the rear. The parlor door slammed shut behind them as they burst into the foyer, the house shuddering as if in rage. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and still. They huddled on the veranda, the grand columns looming like sentinels. The front door, once their escape, now oozed from its seams, barring the way back in or out. "We have to burn it," Theo said, voice hoarse, staring at the blood-stained handkerchief Clara still clutched. The book mentioned fire, purifying the bound. Elias looked at the house, its windows' dark eyes watching. The cost weighed on him, the Greystone legacy, built on stolen lives, now devouring its own. Lila whimpered, her hand blistered where the blood had touched. Dawn was hours away, and the wall's hunger seemed endless. But as the first bird called in the misty fields, a new trickle appeared on the veranda rail, inching toward them. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun to claim its due. Elias wiped the blood from his hands onto his shirt, the crimson smears blending with the sweat-soaked fabric like an accusation. The hallway stretched before him, dim and heavy with the scent of damp earth and iron, the walls pulsing faintly under the lantern's glow. Thomas huddled against the banister, his face pale but eyes sharp, clutching the iron poker they'd pried from the fireplace downstairs. "Pa, it's spreading," he whispered, nodding toward the staircase where fresh rivulets trickled down the steps, as if the house itself wept in slow motion. Clara emerged from the parlor door, her skirt torn at the hem from scrambling over debris earlier that evening. She carried the family Bible, its leather cover stained with what looked like old wine, but wasn't. "The attics know better," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. "I thought sealing the windows with salt would hold it back, like old man Thibodeau said, but the glass, it cracked from the inside." Eliza trailed behind her, the girl's small hand gripping her mother's apron, her wide eyes reflecting the lantern's flame like twin accusations against the shadows. They had tried the ritual at dusk, drawing a circle of flour and reciting the verses Elias remembered from his grandfather's tales, words meant to bind whatever spirit haunted the Greystone lands since the fever took half the slaves a decade back. But the plan had unraveled when the floorboards groaned and split, forcing them to flee as the bleeding seeped up from below, staining their boots and turning the air thick with a metallic tang. Now, with night fully cloaked over the bayou, the house seemed to breathe deeper, the walls not just leaking but whispering, faint murmurs that clawed at the edges of their sanity. "Can't stay here," Elias muttered, glancing at the front door they'd barricaded with the oak table. The rival whispers from outside, the rustle of Spanish moss in the wind, or something worse, had kept them pinned inside since the sun dipped low. He stepped forward, pressing his palm against the wall experimentally. It yielded like warm clay, a single drop welling up to trace his lifeline. Thomas noticed and yanked his father's hand back. "Don't. Last time, it followed you." Clara knelt beside Eliza, pulling her close. "We'll go through the root cellar. The ground's solid there, no walls to touch." Her words carried the weight of desperation masked as resolve, but Elias saw the doubt in her eyes, the way she avoided looking at the ceiling where cracks spiderwebbed like veins. The girl nodded, but her lower lip quivered, and she clutched a locket, her mother's, with a lock of hair from the brother lost to the swamps years ago. They moved as a unit, Thomas leading with the poker raised, the lantern swinging and Elias's grip casting erratic shadows that danced like specters. The kitchen door creaked open under Clara's push, revealing the pantry's gloom, but as they passed the threshold, the floor tilted subtly, a low rumble vibrating through the planks. "It's the foundation," Thomas hissed, steadying himself against a cabinet that suddenly wept red from its seams. They pressed on, descending the narrow stairs to the cellar, the air growing cooler, mustier, laced with the rot of forgotten jars and earth. Down in the dimness, the lantern revealed shelves of cobwebbed preserves and the dirt-packed floor leading to the outer hats. Eliza's breathing quickened, her small frame pressing against Clara. "Mama, I hear it. Singing." The words hung, and Elias froze, straining his ears. There it was, a faint, lilting tune, like a lullaby warped through water, emanating from the walls that bordered the bayou side. Not bleeding here, but humming, the soil itself alive with malice. Thomas jammed the poker into the hatch's rusted lock, twisting until it gave with a snap. Fresh night air rushed in, carrying the croak of frogs and the distant lap of water against the dock. Freedom, almost. But as Elias pushed the hatch open, a hand, pale, elongated, fingers like roots, clutched at the edge from below, pulling with unnatural strength. Clara screamed, shoving Eliza behind her, while Thomas swung the poker down, the iron connecting with a sickening thud that echoed like a promise of more to come. The thing recoiled with a gurgle, but the hatch wouldn't fully lift, the ground sucking at it like mud. Elias dropped the lantern, grabbing the edge with both hands, his muscles straining against the pull. Together, now. Blood from his earlier touch smeared the wood, and for a moment, the walls around them wept in sympathy, droplets pattering like rain. They heaved as one, the family linked in frantic effort, the singing rising to a wail that clawed at their ears. It gave way suddenly, the hatch flinging open to spill them onto the dew-slick grass. But as they tumbled out, gasping, Elias glanced back. The house loomed, its windows dark eyes, and from the foundation, more hands emerged, clawing at the earth they'd just escaped. The bleeding had followed, staining the soil red, and in the distance, the bayou waters churned, as if the spirit hungered for them still. Elias pressed his back against the splintered doorframe, the air thick with the metallic tang of blood that seemed to seep from every crevice of the Greystone manor. His hands, wrapped in strips of his wife's torn petticoat, trembled as he clutched the iron poker from the parlor hearth. The bleeding had worsened since dusk. Now it wasn't just the walls but the floorboards themselves, pooling in dark, viscous lakes that lapped at his boots. He could hear the children upstairs, their muffled sobs cutting through the relentless drip-drip from the chandelier above, where crimson droplets fell like slow rain.
Pa?
Is it over? Young Clara's voice floated down the stairs, fragile as a moth's wing. She was only 10, her brother's shadow since the fever took their mother 2 summers back. Elias swallowed hard, tasting rust on his tongue. He wanted to lie, to say the priest's prayers had chased the devil away, but the truth clawed at his throat. The walls had started bleeding the night they buried the last overseer on the plantation grounds, old Harlan, with his whip-scarred secrets and whispers of buried wrongs. Now the house demanded payment, touch by touch. "Not yet, darlin'. Stay with Tomas. Don't come down." His voice cracked, echoing unnaturally in the foyer. He glanced at the grandfather clock, its face smeared red, the hands frozen at the hour of Harlan's death. 3 strikes from midnight, and the bleeding pulsed like a heartbeat. Elias edged toward the kitchen, where the family's last hope lay, the voodoo charm from Widow Laveau's kin, smuggled in by a freedman who'd vanished into the bayou. It was a gnarled root wrapped in salt and feathers, meant to bind whatever spirit festered here. The floor groaned under his weight, and a fresh seep welled up around his heel, warm and insistent, soaking through the cloth. He yanked his foot free with a curse, the poker slipping in his grip. Memories flooded him. Nights spent poring over Harlan's ledgers by lantern light, uncovering the graves of runaways hidden beneath the cane fields. The blood wasn't just illusion, it was accusation, drawn from the earth itself. Elias had thought burning the ledgers would end it, but that had only made the walls weep louder, as if the house mourned its silence dead. In the kitchen, moonlight slanted through the shattered window, casting elongated shadows that writhed like vines. The charm sat on the scarred oak table, untouched since he'd placed it there at sundown. He reached for it, hesitating as his bandaged fingers hovered inches away. The air grew heavier, pressing on his chest, and from the walls came a low murmur, not words, but a chorus of sighs, like wind through cracked bones. Clara's footsteps pattered overhead, defying his order. Tomas's deeper voice hushed her, but Elias knew they were listening, waiting for him to fix what he couldn't. He snatched the root, its texture rough and alive against his palm. No blood welled from his touch this time. Progress. Or trap. Chanting the words the freedman had taught him, half-remembered Creole syllables that burned his tongue, Elias thrust the poker into the hearth's embers. Sparks flew, illuminating the room in fleeting orange. The murmur swelled, and the blood on the floor began to recede, inching back toward the cracks like a tide in reverse. But then a sharper sound, a child's scream from above, not fear, but pain. Elias bolted for the stairs, charm clutched tight, the poker glowing faintly red. The steps were slick, each one sucking at his soles, as if reluctant to let him pass. Halfway up, the banister wept beneath his free hand, staining the cloth crimson anew. He didn't stop. At the landing, the door to the children's room hung ajar, and through the gap, he saw Tomas kneeling by the window, Clara curled at his feet, her small hand pressed to the wall. Blood trickled from her fingers, not the house's, but her own, where the plaster had split open like flesh. Tomas, what happened? Elias burst in, dropping to his knees beside them. The boy, 14 and already broad-shouldered like his father, looked up with eyes wide and haunted. She touched it, Pa said the voices told her to. It's pulling. Clara whimpered, her face pale as moonlight. They want out, Pa. The ones under the fields. I felt them. Elias unwrapped her hand, the cut shallow but pulsing in time with the house's rhythm. He pressed the charm to the wound, murmuring the chant louder now, willing the salt and root to draw the malice away. The walls around them shuddered, a deep groan rising from the foundation, and for a moment, the bleeding halted. But outside, thunder rumbled over the bayou, and Elias knew the night wasn't done claiming its due. The family huddled together, the poker cooling in his lap, as the first real rain began to fall, heavy, unrelenting, washing the blood from the windows, but promising floods that would unearth what the house had long concealed. Elias Greystone's hands trembled as he gripped the rusted lantern, its flame flickering like a dying heartbeat against the suffocating dark of the attic. The air up here was thicker, laced with the metallic tang of blood that never quite faded, no matter how many times they scrubbed or prayed. Beside him, his wife Clara knelt by the splintered trunk they'd pried open earlier that evening, her fingers stained crimson from the last futile attempt to staunch the flow. Their daughter, little Marie, huddled in the corner, her wide eyes reflecting the lantern's glow, whispering the same nursery rhyme she'd clung to since the bleeding started 3 nights ago. "We can't keep doing this," Clara murmured, her voice a raw thread in the silence. She wiped her palms on her apron, but the red smears only spread, blooming like accusations across the faded cotton. The walls around them pulsed faintly now, not with the violent gush of before, but a slow seep, as if the house itself were exhaling its secrets. Elias nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. The old conjure woman in the bayou had sworn the trunk held the key, a bundle of letters from his grandfather, the man who'd built this cursed place on stolen land. But the words inside spoke only of deaths and fevers, nothing to unravel the horror that made their home weep. Marie shifted, her small boots scraping against the floorboards that creaked like old bones. "Papa, it's coming again," she said, pointing to the far wall where a fresh rivulet traced down from the rafters, dark and viscous, pooling at the base like spilled ink. Elias swung the lantern closer, the light catching motes of dust that swirled like spirits disturbed from slumber. He'd tried sealing the cracks with mud from the riverbank, reciting the psalms his mother taught him, even burning sage smuggled from the French quarter. Each time, the bleeding worsened, as if the house fed on their desperation. Clara rose, her face gaunt in the shadows, and pressed her ear to the wall. "Listen," she whispered. A low thrum vibrated through the wood, not the wind rattling the shutters downstairs, but something deeper, rhythmic, like a heart buried in the foundation. Elias felt it too, a pull in his chest that made his own pulse stutter. The family had dwindled since the affliction began. His brother Thomas had fled 2 days past, muttering about ghosts of the enslaved who toiled here before the war's whispers reached Louisiana. Now it was just the three of them, barricaded in the attic while the lower floors drowned in red. He set the lantern down and rummaged deeper into the trunk, pulling out a brittle photograph yellowed with age. It showed his grandfather standing proud before the half-built manor, axe in hand, beside a group of figures half hidden in shadow, workers, perhaps, their faces blurred as if the image itself rejected them. "This place was meant to be our legacy," Elias said, his voice cracking. "Not this nightmare." Clara took the photo, her thumb smudging the edge, and for a moment, the wall behind her wept faster, droplets pattering like rain on the floor. Marie crawled forward, brave in her fear, and touched the pooling blood. It clung to her skin, warm and sticky, but she didn't cry out. Instead, she looked up at her parents with eyes too old for her 7 years. "We have to let it out, Mama." Like squeezing a bruise. Clara pulled her close, but the girl's words hung in the air, simple and terrifying. Elias stared at the wall, the seep now a steady trickle carving paths like veins. The conjure woman's warning echoed in his mind. The house bled because it remembered what they'd forgotten. The blood of those who'd laid the stones, mixed with sweat and chains. Downstairs, a door groaned open, though they'd nailed every entrance shut. The thrum grew louder, vibrating up through the floor, and Elias realized with a chill that it wasn't just the house. It was calling them, drawing them down into its crimson heart. Clara clutched the photo tighter, her knuckles white. "We go together or not at all," she said, and in that moment, as the blood lapped at their feet, Elias knew their fight wasn't against the walls, but the sins woven into them. Marie nodded, slipping her hand into his, and they moved toward the attic stairs, the lantern's light casting long shadows that bled into the dark. Elias's hand trembled as he gripped the rusted lantern, its flame flickering against the damp walls of the cellar. The air hung thick with a metallic tang of blood, sharper now, as if the house itself were exhaling its last breath. Clara knelt beside him, her fingers stained red from the final touch that had unleashed the flood, not just droplets, but a gush that pooled around their boots, warm and insistent, carrying whispers of names long buried. Thomas stood at the threshold, his usual quip silenced by the sight of the altar they'd uncovered, a crude wooden slab etched with symbols that twisted like veins, holding the locket Clara's grandmother had sworn was a family heirloom. The bleeding had started slow, months ago, after Elias dismissed the overseer's warnings about the old slave quarters beneath the floorboards. One touch from Clara during a storm, and the walls wept. It escalated with each denial, first seeping through cracks at night, then staining linens and skin. Thomas had joked about it being the house's way of demanding tribute, but his laughter died when the blood formed patterns, spelling accusations in the candlelight. Murderer, thief, betrayer. The family's secret unraveled thread by thread. The locket wasn't an heirloom but a curse, forged from the blood of those Elias's grandfather had worked to death, bound by a voodoo priestess's dying rage. Now, with the house groaning above them like a beast in agony, Elias pressed the lantern to the altar's edge. "We end it here," he murmured, voice steady despite the fear clawing his throat. Clara nodded, her bravery a quiet fire. She'd been the one to insist they descend, to face what they'd ignored. Thomas edged closer, prying the locket free with a knife, his hands slick but sure. The blood surged then, rising to their knees, pulling at their legs like hands from the earth. Visions flashed, whips cracking, chains rattling, faces twisted in silent screams, each one a fragment of the past they'd inherited. Clara gasped as a tendril of crimson wrapped her wrist, cold despite its warmth, dragging her toward the slab. Elias lunged, shoving the lantern forward. Flames licked the wood, igniting the pooled blood in a hiss of steam. Thomas yanked her back, the locket slipping into the fire, its chain melting like a serpent's spine. The house shuddered violently, floorboards splintering overhead, dust raining down in choking clouds. The bleeding slowed, then stopped, the liquid receding into cracks that sealed like wounds. They climbed out as dawn broke, the mansion sagging against the horizon, its walls scarred but dry. Elias supported Clara, her arm limp where the blood had burned like acid, leaving a mark that would never fade, a reminder etched into flesh. Thomas scanned the fields, the overseer's old cabin a shadow in the mist. Freedom for the land meant chains for their legacy. The family stood together on the porch, the air clean for the first time in months, but the silence carried weight. Elias knew they'd rebuild, but the house's hunger lingered in their veins, a quiet promise that some debts bled eternal.